27 nations have received an unprecedented directive from Washington. The message is simple, yet staggering in its implications. Impose sweeping 100% tariffs on all Chinese imports. The official justification? To strangle Russia's energy revenues while simultaneously containing China's economic rise through what the White House calls secondary sanctions. This isn't just another trade dispute. This represents one of the most ambitious economic pressure campaigns in modern history. Never before has such a coordinated attempt been made to economically isolate the world's second-largest economy. But here's where the story takes an intriguing turn. America isn't leading this charge from the front. Instead, Washington is asking its allies to step into the firing line first, with promises to join the offensive only after others have absorbed the initial backlash. The strategy raises, well, some uncomfortable questions. Is the United States outsourcing the risks of economic warfare to its partners? Will these 27 countries actually comply with Washington's demands? And perhaps most critically, how will Beijing respond when the world's largest trading nation finds itself surrounded by tariff walls? Today we're diving deep into the anatomy of a trade war that could reshape the global economy. Stay with us. To understand where we are now, we need to rewind to the beginning of this year. In the first 6 months of 2025, a wave of tariff increases swept across the planet. The epicenter of this economic earthquake? The White House. In July, President Trump put his signature on an executive order that sent shockwaves through international commerce. With one pen stroke, tariffs were raised on imports from more than 180 countries and territories. This wasn't selective targeting. This was a blanket assault on the existing trade order. Even America's closest economic partners found themselves caught in the crossfire. The tariff structure that emerged was telling. Most countries saw their rates climb to approximately 15%. Only a select few, the United Kingdom and Japan among them, managed to negotiate somewhat lower rates thanks to special bilateral agreements that gave them preferential treatment. But make no mistake, the real target was always clear. China became the focal point of this trade offensive early on. In February, Washington slapped an initial 10% tariff on Chinese goods, targeting critical sectors like electronics manufacturing, industrial machinery, and chemical products. Before the month was even over, another 10% was piled on, bringing the total to 20%. The message was unmistakable. This was just the beginning. Beijing's response was notably restrained at first. Rather than immediately retaliating, Chinese officials repeatedly called for dialogue and negotiation. They emphasized the interconnected nature of the two economies and warned against the dangers of escalation. But patience has its limits. By April, the situation exploded. The United States made a move that stunned economists. Worldwide tariffs on Chinese goods were raised to a staggering 145%. Let me repeat that. 145%. To put this in historical context, this is one of the highest tariff rates ever imposed between major trading partners in the modern era. These weren't the protectionist measures of the 1930s. This was economic warfare dressed in policy language. But as with many aggressive trade actions, the consequences proved far more complex than anticipated. The impact ricocheted back onto American soil with surprising force. Consider the reality of American consumption. Roughly 80% of everyday consumer goods available in U.S. stores are manufactured in China. When you impose a 145% tariff on those goods, the math becomes brutal for ordinary shoppers. Retail prices jumped by an average of 45%. This wasn't an abstract economic indicator. This was felt in every aisle of every supermarket and big box store across America. Let's make this concrete. A Tesla Model 3, already a significant purchase for middle-class families, saw its price increase by at least $12,000. Even something as simple as a Lego set, a toy for children, now cost families an additional $50. These weren't luxury items being taxed out of reach. These were the purchases of everyday life, suddenly placed beyond the budget of millions of American households. The cruel irony of Trump's tariff policy became impossible to ignore. It was American consumers who were paying the premium for Chinese goods, not Chinese manufacturers. The intended punishment had boomeranged. The economic pain proved unsustainable. On May 12th, representatives from Beijing and Washington met in Geneva, Switzerland, neutral ground for high-stakes negotiations. What emerged from those talks was remarkable. Both sides agreed to cancel 91% of their respective tariffs. Think about that for a moment. After months of escalating rhetoric, after disrupting global supply chains and inflicting economic damage on both sides, the two largest economies in the world essentially hit the reset button. The trade war that had dominated headlines and terrified business leaders around the world suddenly reached a point of détente. But this temporary peace raises a fundamental question. Why did the United States launch this global tariff offensive in the first place? President Trump has consistently framed his tariff policy as a solution to America's trade deficit. The narrative is straightforward and politically appealing. Other countries engage in unfair trade practices, accumulate massive surpluses at America's expense, and tariffs are simply leveling the playing field. This explanation has been repeated so often by politicians that it's taken on the quality of conventional wisdom. But the reality is considerably more nuanced and more troubling for Washington. In April of this year, the International Monetary Fund released a forecast that sent quiet tremors through economic circles. The IMF downgraded its prediction for global economic growth in 2025 from 3.3% to 2.8%. That half-point drop might sound modest, but in the context of the global economy, it represents hundreds of billions of dollars in lost activity. More alarmingly for the United States, the IMF raised the probability of an American recession from 27% to 40%. These aren't abstract percentages. They represent a near coin-flip chance that the world's largest economy could contract in the coming year. The signals are clear. The American economy is showing significant weakness. Against this backdrop, imposing tariffs on the rest of the world becomes less about trade fairness and more about generating revenue to address mounting fiscal pressures. Tariffs, after all, are a form of taxation, and when government coffers are under strain, new revenue sources become politically attractive. Then there's the employment picture, which tells its own troubling story. Just days before the latest tariff announcements, the U.S. Department of Labor released its July jobs report. The numbers were dismal. Non-farm payroll employment increased by only 73,000 positions, well below the anticipated 100,000, and a figure that barely keeps pace with population growth. But it got worse. The department also revised its previous reports downward, removing 258,000 jobs from the May and June totals. In other words, the American labor market wasn't just slowing down, it had been weaker all along than anyone realized. For an administration that has staked much of its credibility on economic performance, these figures represent a serious political problem. Tariffs, in this context, become a tool not just for raising revenue, but for reshaping the narrative. By forcing manufacturing back to American soil through trade barriers, the hope is to create jobs and demonstrate economic renewal. Which brings us to September 10, 2025, and a meeting that would reshape the contours of this entire conflict. President Trump convened a closed-door session with several senior European officials. The stated agenda was straightforward coordinate strategy on Ukraine and discuss how to intensify pressure on Russia. But according to sources familiar with the discussion, Trump pivoted to an entirely different subject. He proposed something that caught even seasoned diplomats off guard. What if the European Union's 27 member states could unite behind a 100% punitive tariff on all Chinese goods? Trump argued that such a move would simultaneously address the Ukraine situation and contain China's economic influence. The logic, as presented, went like this. By cutting off China's trade with Europe, Beijing would have fewer resources to purchase Russian energy. Deprived of its largest customer, Russia would see its war revenues collapse, forcing Moscow to the negotiating table. But here's what made this proposal so unusual. Trump wasn't offering American leadership. He was asking Europe to go first. Washington, he indicated, would only join the tariff campaign after the EU had already committed and absorbed the initial consequences. This represents a significant departure from traditional American foreign policy. Normally, the United States positions itself at the forefront of international initiatives, rallying allies to follow its lead. This time, Washington was asking others to take the first and potentially most damaging step. The motivation behind this approach becomes clearer when you consider Trump's track record on Ukraine. For 6 months now, the president has repeatedly promised to resolve the Russia-Ukraine conflict. He even set a 50-day deadline for Putin, threatening to impose 100% tariffs on all Russian goods if Moscow didn't enter negotiations. Trump went further, introducing the concept of secondary sanctions, essentially threatening any country that continues purchasing Russian oil with tariffs as high as 500%. This was aimed squarely at Russia's remaining customers, and China sits at the top of that list. Before the war in Ukraine began, China was already importing more than 80 million tons of crude oil from Russia annually, representing approximately $35 billion in trade. But since the conflict started, these volumes have surged dramatically. By 2024, Chinese purchases of Russian oil exceeded 100 million tons, an increase of more than 20 million tons, with annual trade value reaching $62 billion. Natural gas tells a similar story. China has become a massive importer of Russian gas, with annual trade volumes hitting 50 billion cubic meters. For Russia's economy, which has been hammered by Western sanctions, these energy sales to China represent an economic lifeline. From Trump's perspective, this energy trade is what enables Putin to sustain the war effort. Cut off the buyers, and you cut off the funding. Force Russia to the table through economic starvation. But there's a problem with this strategy. Trump has now been in office for nearly 8 months, and despite the aggressive rhetoric and repeated deadlines, there's been no substantive progress on ending the war. The conflict grinds on, Russian oil continues flowing to China, and the promised breakthrough remains elusive. Hence the pivot to Europe. If Trump can't achieve his objectives through unilateral American action, perhaps a coordinated transatlantic approach could succeed where solo efforts have failed. The 27 EU member states, acting in concert, represent enormous economic power. A unified tariff wall against China might, theoretically, force Beijing to reconsider its relationship with Moscow. There's also a secondary objective at play, containing China itself. Trump's previous tariff campaigns against China achieved limited success. The 145% tariff rate imposed earlier this year was dramatic, but proved unsustainable. Trump appears to have realized that American power alone is insufficient to reshape Chinese behavior. The European Union represents additional leverage. If the EU's 27 members could synchronize their trade policy and launch a coordinated tariff offensive against China, the economic pressure would multiply exponentially. This isn't just about Ukraine, it's about constraining the rise of a strategic competitor. But here's the trillion-dollar question. Will Europe actually follow through? The answer is far from clear, and the internal divisions within Europe are substantial. The European Parliament and the governments of individual member states have notably different perspectives on this issue. Countries like Germany, France, and Italy, which have the deepest economic ties to China, are particularly hesitant. The numbers explain their reluctance. China is the European Union's second-largest trading partner, trailing only the United States. Annual trade between the EU and China reaches hundreds of billions of euros. By 2024, China had become the EU's largest source of imports, accounting for 21.3% of everything Europe buys from abroad. At the same time, the EU exports substantial volumes to China, representing 8.3% of total European exports, making China the bloc's third largest export market. These aren't marginal relationships. These are core economic connections that support millions of European jobs. What happens if you impose 100% tariffs on China? The consequences would be immediate and severe. German automobile manufacturers, which have spent decades building market share in China, would see their export costs double overnight. French cosmetics brands, which have found lucrative markets among China's growing middle class, would likely be displaced by Japanese and Korean competitors. Eastern European nations like Hungary and Slovakia face even more acute concerns. These countries have integrated themselves into Chinese-backed supply chains, often through Belt and Road Initiative investments. If China retaliates by cutting off access to key components and materials, manufacturing in these countries could literally grind to a halt. There's another layer to this problem. Europe is still reeling from the tariffs that America itself imposed earlier. The Trump administration didn't exempt its allies from its tariff offensive, and European industries have been struggling under the pressure of reduced access to the American market. Many sectors are already facing the risk of deindustrialization, the hollowing out of Europe's manufacturing base. If Europe now loses its Chinese market on top of restricted American access, the economic consequences could be catastrophic. You'd essentially be severing two of Europe's three major trade arteries simultaneously. No responsible government can ignore such risks. The political signals from Brussels reflect this reality. European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen has been notably circumspect in her public statements. In recent policy documents, she's emphasized the need for Europe to maintain strategic autonomy while preserving global cooperation. This is diplomatic language, but the meaning is clear. Europe wants to chart its own course, not simply follow American directives. Von der Leyen hasn't explicitly refused Trump's proposal, but she hasn't endorsed it either. This studied ambiguity is itself a message. Europe is not prepared to blindly participate in an economic war that could devastate its own prosperity. Interestingly, China isn't the only target of this latest American tariff campaign. India has also found itself in Washington's crosshairs, and the reasons reveal another dimension of Trump's strategy. Since the Russia-Ukraine conflict began, India has dramatically increased its purchases of Russian oil. By 2025, Russian oil accounts for 37% of India's total petroleum imports, making India the second largest buyer of Russian energy after China. For the United States, which has sought to isolate Russia economically, this represents a major problem. Trump hasn't been shy about expressing his frustration. As early as the beginning of 2025, he publicly criticized India's growing trade surplus with the United States. He specifically called out India's Russian oil purchases, accusing New Delhi of effectively supporting Putin's war effort. On August 6th, the White House released a fact sheet explicitly stating that the Russian oil trade threatens U.S. national interests. Less than 3 weeks later, on August 27th, Trump signed an executive order imposing an additional 25% tariff on goods imported from India. The official justification was punishment for continued Russian energy purchases. But here's the thing. It hasn't worked. India's purchasing behavior has barely changed. The tariffs have inflicted some economic pain, but they haven't achieved their strategic objective of cutting off Russia's energy revenues. This failure illustrates a broader problem with America's tariff-based approach to geopolitics. Economic relationships exist because they're mutually beneficial and often difficult to replace. India buys Russian oil because it's competitively priced and meets India's massive energy needs. A 25% American tariff on Indian goods doesn't change that fundamental calculation. It just makes Indian exports to America more expensive. Which brings us to the core question: can tariffs actually force China to change its behavior? The evidence suggests the answer is no, and the reasons lie deep in the structure of the global economy. China isn't just another trading partner. It's the central node in the world's manufacturing network. Over 4 decades, China has built an industrial ecosystem that is extraordinarily difficult to replicate. The country combines massive scale, sophisticated infrastructure, skilled labor, and integrated supply chains in ways that no other nation can match. Consider this striking fact. The United States relies on Chinese imports for at least 198 different categories of goods. These aren't luxury items or non-essential products. These are critical inputs for American industry and necessary items for American consumers. In contrast, China's dependence on the United States extends to only 68 product categories. This asymmetry reveals the fundamental imbalance in any trade war between the two countries. For many products, if America stops buying from China, finding alternative suppliers at comparable scale, quality, and price is extraordinarily difficult. American businesses and consumers have few viable substitutes. China, on the other hand, has been systematically reducing its dependence on American products and technology. Beijing has invested heavily in domestic alternatives to American semiconductors, software, and industrial equipment. The Chinese market is large enough to support entire industries independently of American access. What does this mean for tariffs? It means the pain is distributed unevenly. When America imposes tariffs on Chinese goods, American consumers and businesses bear much of the cost through higher prices and reduced access to products. When China retaliates with its own tariffs, it can often find alternative suppliers or rely on domestic production. This is why Trump's 145% tariff ultimately proved unsustainable. The economic damage to American consumers and businesses became politically untenable. The Geneva negotiations that rolled back 91% of the tariffs weren't a diplomatic triumph. They were a recognition that the policy had failed to achieve its objectives while inflicting serious self-harm. So where does this leave us? The request for 27 European nations to impose 100% tariffs on China represents the latest evolution in a strategy that has consistently failed to deliver its promised results. The underlying assumption that economic pressure can force China to abandon its relationship with Russia, restructure its trade relationships, and accept American preferences, appears fundamentally flawed. China is simply too large, too economically self-sufficient, and too strategically committed to its current path to be coerced through tariffs alone. For Europe, the decision of whether to join this tariff campaign involves weighing several competing considerations. On one hand, there's the transatlantic relationship with the United States, which remains central to European security and prosperity. Refusing Washington's request could strain these ties at a time when Europe faces security challenges on its eastern border. On the other hand, there's the practical reality of Europe's economic dependence on China. Imposing 100% tariffs would devastate European industries, cost millions of jobs, and potentially trigger a broader economic crisis. No European government wants to explain to its citizens why their living standards are collapsing to satisfy American strategic objectives. There's also the question of sovereignty. The United States is asking Europe to take on the risks and costs of a policy that Washington itself is unwilling to implement first. This dynamic raises uncomfortable questions about whether Europe is being treated as a genuine partner or as a shield to absorb the consequences of American policy decisions. The early indications suggest that Europe will politely decline this particular request. Individual nations may implement targeted measures against specific Chinese companies or sectors, particularly in areas involving national security concerns. But a coordinated, bloc-wide imposition of 100% tariffs across all Chinese goods? The political will for such a dramatic step simply doesn't exist. As we step back and look at the broader picture, what we're witnessing is the unraveling of America's post-Cold War assumption that economic power could be straightforwardly converted into political compliance. For decades, the United States used its position at the center of the global trading system as a source of leverage. Access to the American market was a prize, and the threat of losing that access was a tool of statecraft. But the world has changed. China has built an economic ecosystem that, while not completely independent of the West, is far more self-reliant than it was 20 or even 10 years ago. Other nations, India, Russia, Brazil, and many others, have watched the weaponization of trade and finance and drawn their own conclusions about the risks of dependence. The result is a world that is simultaneously more interconnected and more fragmented. Trade volumes remain enormous, but the relationships are increasingly transactional rather than strategic. Countries are building redundant supply chains, seeking multiple suppliers, and reducing their vulnerability to pressure from any single partner. Trump's request for Europe to impose 100% tariffs on China isn't just a policy proposal. It's a test of whether the old model of American-led economic statecraft still functions. The answer appears to be no. This doesn't mean the end of American influence or the collapse of the existing international order, but it does suggest that the tools of economic pressure that worked in previous decades are becoming progressively less effective. A more multipolar world is emerging, one where no single nation can dictate terms to the others through trade policy alone. For China, Russia, Europe, and the United States, the challenge ahead is finding ways to manage their interdependence without triggering destructive economic conflicts that harm everyone. The tariff wars of 2025 may someday be remembered as the moment when all sides realized that in an integrated global economy, there are no winners in a trade war, only varying degrees of loss. The question is, what comes next?